Well, thank you all for inviting me here to New Mexico. I spent 5 years of my life living in Albuquerque, working at the Air Force Research Lab, and it's always great to have an opportunity to come back and buy some Hatch green chili and bring it home to the wife who grew up here. So that's fantastic. As George said, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and that's kind of a really fancy long title. Any title that's got more than like 2 or 3 words in it means that you probably aren't really that important. So I've got like 6 words, which means I'm really low down the totem pole. But it really, what it really does mean, believe it or not, is that when it comes to space policy, I'm the person in the DoD who gets to go ahead and represent the department in anything and everything that has to do about space. And that's a pretty fun and exciting responsibility. One of the reasons why I wanted to come out here to this conference is because in looking at past conferences, I noticed there's not a lot of defense discussion happening here. And I think that's bad because I see a collision coming, as I say in my title, a collision coming between commercial space and defense space needs. And I think we need to go ahead and think about that collision. And in some cases, that collision may have already occurred. So here's what I'd like to do this morning. I'd like to go ahead and spend very briefly talking to you about a typical day in space policy at the Pentagon. As excited as that sounds, I'll try to make it not too boring. A typical day in space policy at the Pentagon. And then I'd like to go ahead and talk about 3 things, sort of the parallel between the history of air flight in this nation, moving from a defense capability to a commercial capability. And George Neal has promised, if I get the history wrong, he's not going to correct me. Where are you, George? You're sitting out there somewhere, right there. And then to talk a little bit about the intersection between defense and commercial capabilities. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, why is it important for us to understand this? So first, a typical day at the Pentagon. Typical day at the Pentagon space policy starts off not at the Pentagon, it starts off at the White House. Now, truth be told, it's not really at the White House. Okay, we call it the White House because it makes us feel important. We're actually going to the old executive office building to meet with the National Security Council staff, a bunch of GS-15s and civil servants, but the White House sounds much cooler, so we tell our wives we're going to the White House. And that meeting is called because the president wants to know, what are we going to do about the RD-180 and the fact that we are importing it from Russia? Now, never mind that the engine is imported by a commercial space launch company called ULA from a commercial contractor called Ergomash into the nation, and we never actually buy the rocket. We only go ahead and buy the service to go ahead and launch into space. But the president and the Congress still want to know, what are we going to do about that? And that meeting, and Gerst, who was up here earlier, has been in plenty of those meetings with me. Gerst, where are you out there? You're somewhere in the audience, right? So been in those fun meetings out there. And then from there, I head over to the State Department. And at the State Department, we want to go ahead and talk about export control policy. How can we allow U.S. commercial firms to export advanced space hardware to other nations? Isn't there a security risk about that? For example, how could you possibly go ahead and allow a firm like Axcelis to export optical apertures of greater than 35 centimeters to countries like France because of the problems that might exist from a security perspective, regardless of the fact that like 9 other countries in the world export apertures up to 1 meter large. And then a quick jaunt over to NASA, where we needed to go ahead and talk to them about all of these things that are coming off of the commercial space flights, space resupply missions to the space station. They call them CubeSats, we call them debris. And what are we going to do about that? Okay, and you know, if you have time, then I'll go over to see George over at the FAA, and we'll talk about the fact that the FAA really should be in charge of managing what's going on in space, but like they don't have any capability to do so, and how are we going to do that in order to go ahead and make it happen? Because it's not really a protection job we're doing out there. It's not a defense job. Now, I don't have enough time to go up to Bethesda, Maryland, but if I did, we'd go talk to NOAA about the fact that there are these upstart firms who actually want to sell weather data commercially to the nation instead of NOAA going ahead and actually building their own satellites and creating their own weather data. And then I get to head back to the Pentagon for lunch, where I can now finally start to talk about things like how do I defend the nation against foreign space threats instead of all this commercial stuff that I've been doing all morning. But that's not, now really that doesn't all happen before lunch. It's usually by about 3 in the afternoon. But that's not atypical of the kind of things that we'll talk about. Not to mention firms like AGI. I saw some of my AGI friends here earlier today, I think. There they are. Who want to go ahead and who believe they can do space monitoring and SSA better than the US government for a cheaper price and sell that service commercially. So these are the kind of things that we get to talk about all the time. And that's pretty exciting stuff, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. So that's the typical day, and I think it's good for us to stand back then and say, so what does this all mean to us? What should we go ahead and do about this? What do we need to do about this? And when I think about that question, I look about how did we handle a similar kind of collision that occurred in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s in air flight. And so I want to take you back a little bit on the history of air transport in this country to kind of draw some of those parallels out. Now, many of you know that air transport may have started in 1903 somewhere in the beaches of the east coast of North Carolina, but there's really some critical roles that were played right here in New Mexico and in the border state next door in Arizona. And that's because soon after Congress passed the Commercial Aviation Act, which was put together back in 1926 because we believed that in order to go ahead and have a vibrant commercial space or air flight industry, we needed to go ahead and have some regulation. Soon after that act was passed in 1934, a senator from the great state of New Mexico, Budding Conson, I think is his name, was killed in an aircraft. That followed a crash earlier 4 years ago where Newt Rockne was killed in an air crash. And folks said, you know, we need to start regulating this industry a little bit more than just going ahead and worrying about commerce. We need to worry about safety. And so they stood up the Civil Aviation Board and the Civil Aviation Authority for the nation. The name changed a couple of times when we went through there, but its role was to try to regulate air traffic management through the nation. And yet, even with that role established in the 30s and the 40s, after World War II, in the 50s, a major collision happened in the state next door over the Grand Canyon between two commercial airliners, two passenger airliners, and 128 passengers were killed. And out of that grew the Federal Aviation Administration. It wasn't called that originally, but that's what it has grown into today. And there was a sort of a parallel going on there between, or a synchronicity going on there between trying to encourage commercial air flight and ensure the safety of commercial air flight. Now, those weren't really defense things, except for the fact that that first flight back by the Wright Brothers and the first real aircraft built by the aviation industry were built for defense purposes. Those aircraft were built under contract to the Defense Department, the War Department at the time, the Army actually, back in the early 1900s. And that begot a civil and commercial air industry that was not anticipated when we developed this war machine called airplanes. And the same is very true about spaceflight. In spaceflight, we developed space capabilities for national security purposes. We created the things that we have in space in the 50s and the 60s as a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, as somewhat of a proxy for the nuclear contest that was happening on the ground, to make sure that we could stay ahead in this high technology field that has now blossomed into a whole bunch of defense applications. And we never anticipated, really, the huge commercial industry that was going to come 30, 40, 50 years later. We did anticipate it in communications, and so we established very quickly some rules about telecommunications satellites and those kind of satellites and frequencies that we would allow commercial industry to sell. But other than that particular side of the industry, we didn't imagine that you could do anything commercial in space. And so we didn't develop rules of the road for commerce that would occur in space. We didn't develop our space surveillance network in order to go ahead and monitor those rules of the road. We developed that space surveillance network to monitor our defense satellites and hostile satellites from other nations. And yet today, we find out more space launches are being done by non-defense, non-US companies than by the US in the defense area. Many of them are done by other nations which have somewhat of an intersection between the government and commerce, so it's hard to call them all commercial. But more and more, the balance is swinging to commercial. And we haven't really developed the policies, that's my job, all the rules that go ahead and govern how that works. And that's sort of a problem, because harken back to the 1920s, that Civil Aviation Act that was passed, the whole purpose of the act was to encourage commercialization of air flight. We've passed other laws in this nation to encourage the commercialization of space, but none of them have been far-reaching enough in order to go ahead and really address all of the issues. The issues that occur when a hostile Iridium satellite goes ahead and collides with a peace-loving Cosmos satellite. It had to maneuver twice to hit that satellite, by the way. It didn't just maneuver once to do it. And the problem is that nobody's there to say, you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't move. And how does that affect the value of that satellite? How does it affect the value of that constellation? Even more importantly, who's responsible for the 2,000 pieces of debris and the impact that might have on other commercial interests? Those rules, those questions are unanswered today. And there's bigger questions than that. One of the reasons that we have safety in air flight today is because we have air corridors and we have altitudes that we fly at. So if you're a major commercial capability in space, you have to fly eastward at one altitude and westward at another altitude. You got to follow certain rules. You get told by air traffic controllers where you should fly. The only person telling you where to fly when you're in space is Johannes Kepler, and he's been dead for a while. So it's not really active control, so to speak, okay? So these are problems that we haven't really figured out yet. Now, what does this intersection mean? What does this intersection mean for defense, and what are the things we should think about when we talk about this intersection? Well, this intersection is very important because it comes at a critical point in space for the nation. And that critical point can be characterized by two things: declining US government investment in space, increasing adversary government investment in space. For the first time in about 50 years, the US government investment in space was the contributor to a decline in investment in space worldwide rather than an increase in investment in space worldwide. And that happened just 2 years ago. Meanwhile, other governments are investing at rates greater than we have seen in this nation percentage-wise since the 50s in order to advance their own space programs, some of those hostile to our needs. And that becomes a big defense problem. And you look at that and you say to yourself, what are we going to do about this? Our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Coast Guards, and they rely on advanced US space capabilities to go ahead and keep them safe on the battlefield, to help this nation win the fights that the president goes ahead and tells us to win. And yet we see other nations rapidly gaining on the road to surpassing us in space. And this isn't like back in the 80s with the Strategic Defense Initiative with Ronald Reagan, where you could outspend the adversary because he's going to have more money from us. Every economic prediction in the book says he's going to have more money than us. And so we need to figure out how we go ahead and stay ahead. And part of the way we keep the country's technology lead is not by investment of the US government, but by investment of commercial space interests to make sure they keep on creating the things that we don't have the money to necessarily create any longer, or that we choose not to go ahead and spend. And in fact, if you look at the 2010 National Space Policy that the President signed out, it just as well may have said that in bold capital letters. We are going to rely on commercial space to go ahead and drive the future of this nation in space, not just in defense, but in space writ large. Commercial space launch, the only way this nation gets to space today is through a commercial firms that launch things into space. We don't have any US government-owned space systems anymore. Congratulate NASA on the award of the Commercial Crew contract just recently. A huge step forward. I don't know about you, but I remember about 15 years ago when somebody said we were going to do this thing, we were going to let commercial firms carry astronauts to the space station, and I thought it was a joke, quite frankly. I chuckled at it, and yet we are on the cusp of doing that. We just awarded the contract to do it. That commercial inventiveness will go ahead and maintain the kind of robust investment that we need. But that robust investment and that commercialization comes with a cost. There's security concerns. There's security concerns when I go back to that meeting in the Pentagon after I leave the White House and I have folks from Digital Globe sitting in my office want to know how they're going to go ahead and get license authority to sell imagery at a 1/4 meter resolution around the world commercially. And I've got a whole phalanx of people telling me that the world will end, as I know it, if we allow them to go ahead and sell that imagery. That our soldiers, sailors, and airmen will be at risk, that we will go ahead and suffer increased casualties if that imagery is for sale. And that was a big discussion that we had over the summer. Again, at the White House. Remember, it's not really the White House. But again, at the White House, I had that discussion. And we decided that in the balance between these two questions, that allowing commercial industry to sell at an increased resolution was to our overall advantage, kept U.S. industry ahead of the game, prevented U.S. industry from going offshore to go ahead and do the same thing, and allowed the defense industry to go ahead and reap the advantages of this advanced imagery themselves. So we didn't need to make that investment. And the same is true for all of the fantastically entrepreneurial imagery upstart or startups, I guess that's the real current term, but some people call them upstarts, that are coming along from the folks from Skybox who have demonstrated an ability to launch a satellite and turn it on and get images back. I think it was in 48 hours from actual release in space. That was a fantastic event. We take about 48 months sometimes, but to see it done commercially in 48 hours, because there's dollars connected to it, that represents a bold new capability that now the Defense Department can go ahead and use. When we want to go ahead and figure out how do we go ahead and carry all of the bandwidth necessary to conduct modern warfare around the world, we could try to go ahead and buy all our own wideband satellites, or we can recognize there are already 450 of them in space, and maybe we just need to figure out a better way to work with all the manufacturers, 80% of which comes from the United States anyway, to go ahead and have those meet our needs. There's an intersection between defense needs and commercial needs that we need to learn to exploit, and you can't exploit them if you're fearful of them. You can only exploit them by inviting them in, by figuring out how to work with them. And I've got a whole bunch of folks who are doing jobs that aren't defense jobs within the DoD. I've got a whole bunch of folks who are monitoring every day the 20,000 objects that we track and the 10,000 objects that we routinely lose, monitoring every day those objects in space, none of which have hostile intent, all of which are simply flying around based upon the air traffic control rules that Johannes Kepler, I talked about earlier, have dictated. They don't have hostile intent, but still I have uniformed military personnel tracking them as if that's a defense role, instead of doing what they should be doing, which is to figure out which of those guys really are hostile, and those are the ones that I need to track. And somebody else needs to be responsible for going ahead and watching those other objects which aren't hostile but do need to be monitored nonetheless. And then we really get into some interesting things that the government, that the Defense Department is not suited to do. As space becomes more congested, it's clear that at some point you're going to have to set up rules for how do you fly in space, how do you have to deorbit, what are the regulations for doing this in order to keep the environment safe for commerce. And the Defense Department are not the ones to go ahead and establish the rules of the road for that. That is not the kind of work the Defense Department does. If you get an our way, we'll shoot you down. That's really not good for your commercial business. Okay, so we'd like to have somebody who can go ahead and develop the rules. We really won't shoot you down, by the way. Don't quote me. Anybody in the press here? Thank you. The things that you would do to go ahead and create a space environment that's inviting to commerce aren't things that come naturally to the DoD. And so why is this all important? Why is this intersection so important? This intersection is critically important to allude back to what I said earlier. This is the way we will stay ahead in space. This is the way the U.S. will stay ahead of others in space for defense needs and for commercial needs. There's two things that no other nation has ever matched the U.S. in. One of those is the commercial entrepreneurial spirit. That's what built this country. That's what makes this country the leader in the world, is that commercial entrepreneurial spirit. We have that in this nation in every industry, and space is no different than the rest of them. And second is our ability to form alliances. The United States has been more successful than any other nation in the history of mankind to be able to form alliances with others who may want to compete with us commercially, but want to do it as allies and not as adversaries. If we can go ahead and get this balance between defense needs and commercial needs right, if we can go ahead and get the balance between how we allow those commercial capabilities and those commercial firms to sell to both our allies as well as to our own industries, we can stay ahead of any adversary who might want to challenge us in space, regardless of how much money they spend. Because those are the same two things that have kept us ahead in all areas of defense over the history of this department. And so it's critically important that we in the Defense Department figure out how to be welcoming to the commercial space interests and figure out how to leverage it for our needs in the same way we leverage every other industry in this nation to go ahead and meet the defense needs of the nation. And so I'm committed to that. That's part of what I'm trying to do while we're in space policy. I value the opportunity to talk to all of you to understand, are we doing it right? Are the policies in line with that? How do we work through the things that prevent us from doing it? What are the hidden questions that you have or hidden things that I have laid down that I don't even know are barriers to your commercial interest? That's the kind of feedback that I need from you. So my day at the Pentagon is populated by questions of commercial space. We can draw great history from how the FAA was born and how it led to commercialization. And really this intersection between space and defense, or between commercial space and defense, is critical because it, excuse me, it indeed will be the force by which we stay ahead in space over the long term. Thank you very much, and I don't know if I've got any time for questions, but appreciate your attention.
Time for questions. Thank you for being with us this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. And we do have a number of questions here, if you've got just a few minutes.
Absolutely.
The first question, and I'm going to paraphrase it just a little bit, isn't the problem of space traffic control and space debris and on-orbit maneuvering, isn't that a problem for an international body, say the UN, rather than the Department of Defense?
Sure. Great question. That's one of the places where the parallel doesn't quite work with the FAA. Air traffic tends to be territorial. Space traffic tends not to be territorial. And yet, even though air traffic is territorial, and George will correct me here if I get this wrong, we have an organization called ICAO, which is an international civil aviation organization, which is meant to go ahead and correlate and coordinate rules amongst civil aviation agencies around the globe so that we have common standards and we can fly in each other's airspace and we don't have to have different frequencies and radios everywhere we go. It's not an exact parallel. It will be an international activity. Again, something the Defense Department can't do very well. Something that a civil agency is well structured to go ahead and do. Now, I'll probably get into trouble by pointing at the FAA because there's certainly arguments with different civil organizations about who should do this job. My personal view is it's pretty clear to me who should do it, but we'll let that come out in the wash.
Another question is, how would one enforce space rules of the road?
That's a great question. You know, today there's probably the majority of you agree that there is nobody setting up rules for the road, and just like the free ranges that used to reign here in New Mexico, that's just the way you want it. Okay, no fences, let's let the cows go anywhere you want to. The problem is cows and sheep never got along very well. You needed fences for them. So do we want rules for the road? That's a great question. Again, one that is that we need to think about as a federal government and as a commercial space industry. But in general, good rules really enhance the value of commercial activities rather than going ahead and detracting from them. And I think we find that throughout society. The right number of rules, limited but still enacted, is critical. The second part of your question is who enforces them. That's a good question. We've enforced rules today with fines. We enforce rules today with licensing authority. We enforce rules today with other mechanisms that are established by federal regulation. We have a rule today about imaging on the Earth. You're not allowed to image on the Earth any greater than 1/4 meter if you're a U.S. firm, now that is the new standard that we've put in place. You must get licensed to image the Earth. If you violate your license, you will get fined by the licensing organization, in this case NOAA. So that's how you regulate those kind of rules.
Well, internationally, I think.
Well, that's part of that international. That's part of that international coordination that has to happen, right? You know, today when we have international coordination, it's State Department and Defense Department go ahead and talking to State Department and Defense Departments from other nations, and you might expect that since we're all worried about our own national security, we're not really focused on how do these allow our nations to go ahead and do things commercially. When you have civil organizations who are interested in advancing commercial space having that discussion, there's a whole different discussion going on.
We've got time for one last one.
Okay.
As you discuss policies for unmanned spacecraft that are not fully developed, how far behind are policies for commercial human spacecraft?
You know, that's almost a better question that Gerst can answer than I and probably George. Luckily, I don't follow that one, and thankfully I don't have to. I would suspect that it's in just as a poor shape as unmanned space. I think it's going to be very interesting when the Virgin Galactics and even the Commercial Crew stuff comes along, and all of the other folks who want to go ahead and launch people into space. It really is sort of like the birth of the aviation industry. I suspect we will suffer some of the same pitfalls that they experienced. Regulation will follow. I certainly would hope that we're wise enough to not have to live through the same kind of tragedies that we lived through in the aviation field. But at the same time, I recognize that these new uncharted spaces, to use a double entendre, are unclear for most, and our ability to regulate without experience is not very good. So with that, I will thank you very much and say goodbye. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you. So thank you for being with us.